make a picture in your mind of the way the world actually works, of objective reality and your place in it. And then your priorities might change. You might still have that crappy job. You might still have fights with your girlfriend, but you might have a purpose on top of that will actually maybe even transform the way you behave in those situations that you previously and still find yourself in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to MindMatters. Now, I bet many of you have been cooped in your apartments or your house or your flat for the past 3 to 6 weeks. So relax, or longer. So relax, grab your favorite beverage, and join us today because we're going to be discussing a number of interesting topics. The number one topic we'll be starting with being the subject of leisure. Now, that's something that doesn't get a lot of play these days. It's not fashionable to be leisurable or to enjoy just your time to yourself. Because we live in a world that is very materialistic and very focused on utilitarian objectives and work and conscientiousness and action and getting things done and making money. And unfortunately, what goes by the wayside is our human nature in the process. And so I've been reading a book by Josef Pieper called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And Josef Pieper was a German philosopher he was a very, I guess, what would you say? I can't think of the right word.
Erudite? I don't know.
Yes. He was a very erudite philosopher, and he was specialized in studying St. Thomas of Aquinas and basically bringing the Middle Age perspective, the Western kind of spiritual tradition into the 20th century. And he wrote this book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, after World War II. And so he starts the book by saying, of course, this is probably the worst time to be discussing leisure when we have a country to rebuild and when we have the world in shatters and absolute, destruction and mayhem. And yet, at the same time, now more than ever, according to him, was an important time to take stock of what it means to incorporate leisure into your daily life. And the same kind of thing he was saying then could be said today in terms of all the problems that the world is facing, all the problems each of us are facing in our day-to-day lives, and the fact that leisure is so alien to us, to many of us, is because we're not really taught the meaning of leisure or the meaning of what it means to engage in leisure, and how a man of some formidable intellect could say that leisure was the basis of culture is almost asinine to the modern world. It's like, no, that's just being idle, and idle hands are the devil's workshop. But no, there's a very big difference between idleness and leisure. And one of the big things that you take away when reading Pieper's work is that idleness is the opposite of leisure. And in fact, idleness is one of the top deadly sins in the sense that it provokes its opposite. It provokes a sense of workaholism to keep yourself from being idle. That idleness and workaholism go hand in hand because there's some deep inner problem that as a human being you're not able to face, your own spiritual divine nature and look at eye to eye in a moment of serenity, of drifting off into imagination, of questioning things, of just asking questions and following your train of thought wherever it will take you and enjoying what comes out of it. And so that is, I think, something that I really wanted us to talk about today because we have so much time on our hands in this world today. So, that it'd be good to have the tools needed to use it well for our health.
Right, because these days, like you said, these past weeks, a lot of people are forced into having free time that they didn't have beforehand. And you can get an idea of what people are doing by going on social media and and seeing how they're using their free time. And a lot of people are either freaking out or engaging in what might be deemed silly activities, not really doing much. Because I mean, I can empathize and put myself in that position of being engaged in this kind of rat race for all of your adult life, and then all of a sudden not being able to do it, and then what do you do with yourself? You're not used to having this much free time. You don't know what to do with yourself, so you're trying to find things to do, and some people are handling that a little better than others, I'd guess, and that's the way it appears. But what can you actually do with that time? Like what? Well, and also it's the way you framed it. The way you framed Pieper's description of what he was doing and why he was doing it, I think, is relevant, because he said that some people might think this is the worst time for a book on leisure because it was just after a world war and there was destruction everywhere and people had to be engaged in this task of essentially rebuilding civilization to a large degree. So we will be in a similar position these days, where nowadays we have a lot of free time, but there's going to be a lot of fallout from everything that's happening, and there will need to be some rebuilding afterwards. Just looking at the unemployment and getting businesses back on track, and who knows what the world's going to be like in 2 months, or 10 months, or this time next year. So how do we fit that in, not only in our present time, the immediate time right now, but in the coming months and years? Because we will need to, or I think people should, get an idea of what leisure really is, and I hope you'll tell us, Corey, and then to be able to basically integrate those things into their future busy lives, because people are going to go right back to being super busy, as soon as they get their jobs back, essentially, if they get their jobs back. And so for everyone in this situation, there's going to be something of relevance, I think.
Well, one of the descriptions of leisure, as he defines it, he makes reference to the ancient Greek definition of leisure that's loosely connected to school. And when you were speaking a little earlier, Corey, about the idea that you would have this time to focus on culture, on the mind, on things that were important on another level, there is this sense that in what he's writing, that there is this school that we can engage in that isn't so focused and driven by those things that we're constantly told are what you should be doing. So quite interesting there. And like just an observation about how people are occupying themselves, from what I can tell, in our neck of the woods, which is in Western North Carolina, you have a lot of people doing house repairs, and because it's early spring, there's a lot of planting going on. And this would seem to be a very practical use of one's time. And then, you hear about all the folks who are just binging on Netflix, and we've seen articles about the uptick in the use of alcohol and the sale of alcohol, and the consumption of pornography has gone up. So there is this kind of, not strictly speaking, but there is a kind of separation or bifurcation of people and moving towards tendencies that they would most naturally move towards now that they have all of this time. Just because, like what you said a few minutes ago, Harrison, there are some people who just don't know what to do with themselves. And I have to admit that to a certain extent, it's true of myself as well. I've observed it. I have a job outside of some responsibilities to the show and other things, and so there are these chunks of time where I would otherwise have earmarked towards making a living. And it is interesting to me to see how easily I've been kind of prepared in a way to do all the other things that are on the list of things to do that make me feel productive. And looking at the material that we will be discussing today as well, which forms a part of, I think, what you're getting at with this book description.
Yeah, the like you were mentioning the ancient Greek description of leisure, and like Aristotle said that we are not at leisure in order to be at leisure. That's you can say that's an upper class, high class thing to say, is that we only work so that we don't have to work sometimes. But I mean, he was speaking of people in general, just like a basic statement of the human condition, is that we work so that so we can survive, and then there will be time when we can enjoy the company of one another, we can enjoy the festivals, and we can recuperate. And, we can, walk upright once again rather than walking hunched over, like through the Sisyphean kind of labors that we all have to partake in. That's just the human condition, is that we have to work in order to survive. And now more than ever, just how complicated the world is. It needs dedicated technicians, people who apply their intellect towards the most, minute technical details of, computer programs, software engineers, the human body, health, international commerce, law, and, war, and all of these things that go on this plane of existence that, we call the planet Earth. But we miss out on this hidden dimension of our nature when we subordinate all of our time to the world. And so that's why St. Thomas equated, or he identified the cause of this idleness / workaholism as being a sadness and a sickness of the soul caused by the world. That the world can devour you if you allow it to devour you. But that obviously, as a Christian, is like the doctor of the church, this Christian point of view states that we are all connected by a spirit, that we all have a connection to the Spirit of Christ, the Holy Spirit, or whatever you want to call it, and that we, in our leisure, we can hear it. You can hear the Spirit, you can hear the faith. You hear the voice of faith, as I believe as St. Paul put it, and that rather than using your mind for some practical purpose, or rather than engaging in intellectual labor or engaging in anything practical or useful, that there should be a certain amount of time dedicated to what Pieper says is like philosophizing. And the biggest problem though is that there's no one who can tell you what to do at leisure, because it's a part of your spirit, basically, your connection to spirit. And that's a big thing, I think, why it's so easy to get caught up in work, and then as soon as the job is gone, your identity is gone. As soon as the job is gone, you have no connection to anything higher that informs and stabilizes and directs and guides your behavior. Not in every case, clearly, but in many cases where alcoholism starts to go rampant, and then use of pornography, anything that you can do to binge watch on Netflix and just avoid reality, or avoid the situation, or just enjoy yourself. Like, these are things that they'd be called idleness. That's not leisure. That's not actually recuperative. But in order to find what is actually recuperative, you have to begin listening. And you have to allow your instinct to kind of take over, and you start to ask questions. You start to enjoy the life of your own mind, basically. And the thing, like Aristotle said, is like the main question is, what activity do you partake in when you are engaged in leisure? That's the main question that Pieper sets out to answer in the book. And he connects it to philosophy, but also not just philosophy, but love, like real love, where you give of yourself to somebody, and especially in like a festival type arena. He's a very big proponent that the loss of festivals, of this kind of, the dancing together and being together in communion and sacrificing a portion of time to the gods, whether it's one day a week or it's one day every month. Every, human culture has basically had some time that's set off just so that you can sacrifice and give to the gods. And that in some way that was a regenerative type of practice, and that it was, and maybe practical from the sense that if you are experiencing a famine and you want to sacrifice for the gods, that the gods will give you water or food and, restore your crops or whatnot. But that there's something deeply rejuvenating about gathering together in kind of the most impractical way, masks and dancing and craziness. Of course, we're not saying we want everybody to go back to the dark ages of sacrificing lambs or anything like that. But what he's saying is that this is a dimension of the world that is lost when you are living in this kind of Darwinian, materialistic, everything has to be for a purpose. You have to do everything for a darn good reason. You better have a 5-year plan. Otherwise, why are you doing anything at all?
Well, I just want to jump in there real quick and comment on something you said, Corey. I think you used the term, was it active listening?
Something, yeah, maybe.
Something along those lines. Or questioning. Mm-hmm. And so along those lines, I think that there are opportunities we have. I know that when I have a question about something, a real question, a real curiosity, a real thought process that inspires me to think on a particular truth, the answer usually, or some part of the answer, becomes available to me pretty quickly in something I'm reading online or an intuition or something that somebody says. And it's those moments, I think, that when we're not, getting things done, for instance, when we're allowing, it's sort of it might on the surface seem passive, but it's not. It's receptive. Mm-hmm. It's like emptying your cup for long enough to have it filled by something that we don't even know can fill it. This divine, this information field, this cosmic mind, however you want to call it, it's a space that we create for ourselves when we make it for ourselves. And there's something to be said for that too.
Yeah, John Bennett had a little book, I think it's called Creative Thinking. I read it years ago, so I can't remember it precisely, but he gave a little exercise for something like this. He was talking about the thinking process and solving problems. And so the exercise he gave that he said regularly works for him was to, if you're working on a problem, you've got a question, to think about it a lot, do the work, but then in order to actually have the solution come to you, you have to think, and then you have to devote a period to non-thinking, where you purposefully don't think about it. And he says that in that period of time, after that period of not thinking about it, the answer will just pop up in your mind, or at least, if you practice it, that's how it should work, and that's how it does work. And I think those are kind of the phenomenon you talked about is kind of related, because I have the same thing. If I have a question, something that's really, sometimes it's a question, sometimes it's like there's a hole in my in my knowledge field that I want filled. It's like, so I've got this kind of this inner desire or wish for something. And oftentimes for me, because I love books, it's been for just to like reduce it down to something very simple, a book on this topic with this kind of thing in it. Because that book doesn't exist yet, and I really want to know about this particular thing, and I can't find anything about it. And then oftentimes, within a month or within the next year, exactly what I was thinking of that I wanted to exist kind of drops into my lap, and I'm like, oh wow, there it is. That's exactly what I was looking for. And that's happened like countless times. In fact, Joseph Aziz's book that we did the interview with him a couple weeks ago, that was one of those situations. That's one of the things that I wanted, and then here's this book that comes out, and it's like, oh wow, that's exactly what I was looking for. But there's so that's kind of more of a kind of almost a synchronicity, like out in the world process, but there's a similar phenomenon with the mind itself where you're struggling with something, you're putting the effort in, you're working at it, you know. Oh, no, not crazy. And then, but that's the active kind of effortful half of the equation, but then to actually effortfully not put effort in, to actually make the effort not to think about something specific, like don't think about that purple elephant, and to actually do that. Okay, I'm not going to think about this thing. And then you don't think about it for 5, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and then the answer pops into your head. I do remember in the book he was talking about, I think it was an excerpt from a talk that he was giving in the early 70s, and he said that, for example, you know, last week I was just not thinking about the conflict with Turkey and Cyprus. And he says, and after not thinking about it, the solution just pops into my head. And he's like, well, I'm not going to tell anyone because no one's going to listen, and, you know, I won't be able to actually change it. But, you know, I know what the problem is, and I know what the solution would be, just from not thinking about it.
Well, that's really interesting, because I'm thinking about the sinister aspects of a loss of leisure. You know, when we're talking about the things that you can do and how, you know, how just not thinking or not doing anything can bring solutions. But there's a very, you know, just the very simple fact of just experiencing yourself, of knowing yourself in that kind of way of exploring the mind, the life of the mind, is something that obviously, in the aftermath of the Third Reich, was something that had been completely destroyed in Germany. And it reminds me of the book, The Cunning of History, which actually you
Great
recommended
book.
that I read, Alon. And the author, you know, theorized that the concentration camps were really kind of the outgrowth of this natural trend in the Western civilization towards total work. And that's what the Josef Pieper talks about. He's like, we have to get rid of this idea of total work, where you only value people based on what they can give you, right? Based on what they do for you. Mm-hmm. And the concentration camps were just killing fields where you worked people to death, just like the plantations in Barbados.
Work will set you free.
Yes, where work will set you free. You know, that's clearly like the darkest joke that I've ever heard. That's one of the darkest jokes in history. But the thing is that idea is still alive and well in our culture, and it continues, you know, to have sort of an insidious effect in just this kind of Darwinian idea of this meaninglessness to human life. Mm-hmm. That really people only are worth what they give. That if you're a doctor, you know, you're just naturally worth more if you have more money. If you know, the more that you do, the more this or that, and you have to get on the treadmill and you have to work harder and harder, because eventually, you know, work will set you free. That's the German saying, right? But the Russian saying is work will just give you a bent back. Work won't set you free. You'll just get a bent back.
Well, maybe you can tell me, because I haven't read this book, if Pieper talks about this, because there's this idea of leisure. I'm going to use the British pronunciation, leisure, and civilization and culture, that the two kind of go together. Because if you look at the history of even something work-oriented like the sciences or technology, all the developments have usually come from people with some spare time on their hands, people who aren't working, you know, 12 hours a day to survive and to feed their families and things like that. It's only when there is enough wealth in a culture, in a civilization, that frees up some spare time that people can then devote time to, for instance, like artistic pursuits. We wouldn't have our entire kind of Western classical music tradition if we didn't have the ability to employ musicians to do nothing but compose magnificent, extensive pieces of music. You look at, so musicians would need a patron, usually someone to essentially pay them to not have a real job. Like, and that's another thing, you know, people say often to artists, you know, get a real job. Well, it's valid, I think, in some instances, especially with artists that might be considered parasites. But at the same time, all of these aspects of culture are necessary to have a culture, and they would be almost impossible to have as we know them. Of course, every culture every civilization, every non-civilization has had culture, whether it's in the forms of clothing or worship or songs and traditions and myths and all of that stuff. But again, when does that stuff come into play? Well, in ancient times, it would be when you're at leisure around the fire telling stories. That was still an essential part of life. And of course, back like in Paleolithic times, people had more spare time on their hands because they weren't engaged in agriculture, which was this, really tough full-time job. You could hunt and get enough food to last you for a week or two, and then you just hang out for a while and make sure you don't die, and then go out hunting again when you need more food. So there was a lot more leisure time, according to the researchers studying those periods of time based on archaeology and things like that. But in our present time, still there is this space for spare time to produce cultural things, cultural productions, and you need that time to engage your creative mind, essentially. And I think maybe that's the thing that I see as lacking in how people are using their spare time. You will find the creativity does seep out, but it's kind of like a real low level creativity, like you see on Instagram with just Instagram trends, for instance, where people are following a fad that might be creative on some level just because it's not ordinary. But I'm talking about like real creative productions, like when you actually in the sciences, like even all the old scientists, they were like the musician, they were like composers too. They needed to devote all of this time to research and to just thinking and being idle in a sense, but really at leisure to think about things and then have these creative ideas kind of flow into them that then were useful from a practical point of view as well. Mm-hmm. Because that's one of the things I think about leisure time is that, and not thinking or thinking, is that you actually get something that is useful to then implement in your life in areas that aren't those times devoted to your leisure time activities.
Oh, that kind of ties into this kind of the direction that Western philosophy has taken, and kind of its role in this idea that leisure is a kind of a meaningless thing. It's just idleness. It's not practical. It's not fulfilling a function, and a lot of that kind of, as Pieper writes, goes back to Francis Bacon and this idea that knowledge is power, and that the philosopher and the scientists were going to give the tools to conquer the natural world. And then that ran through Descartes, and then kind of culminated finally with Karl Marx, who was like, well, screw it, we're not going to give you the tools to conquer the world. We philosophers are going to conquer the world. And so there's been this drift and this kind of a neutering of philosophy in a real way, and so that it's not about, and of course this is just one school of thought about philosophy, and philosophy itself can't really be narrowed down into, it's pretty much what you think it is. You're never going to get a solid philosophical answer, as Pieper points out, like you're grabbing an apple from a tree. It doesn't just come out like that. Philosophy is its own animal. And I can't remember where I was going with that. Okay, so after, with that kind of neutering of philosophy has come all of the different biases and all the different ways that philosophy has become less practical. It's not about the satisfaction of entertaining a thought and seeing where it goes. Because as Pieper points out, leisure isn't about what you start with, it's about what you end up with. So it's not about what you start doing in your times of leisure, but it's really what you end up with. And then oftentimes, and with just the mind, everybody knows how crazy the mind is. You have to have material, you have to have discipline, you have to have the put in the effort so that you have the right material with which to work with in times of leisure. And sometimes you have to work yourself to the bone, and then you can actually enjoy that time of real actual leisure, because you need that time. But philosophy, obviously, it went off the rails when they said that there was nothing that you could see that there except for sense perception, that visual data was the only kind of, it was purely mechanical, basically what I'm saying. And that there was nothing in the mind that you could see, which was, quite at odds with like St. Thomas and others who believed that the spirit was a real thing, and that in fact, you could probably define the spirit as the ability to comprehend the world, that was spirit. And that there were many different worlds out there and many different types of beings, and that humanity sat at like a hierarchy, owing to our ability to to look at the worlds below us and to internally understand them, and that you could visualize, you could see these things in your mind. It's patently obvious. It's, you don't need a schizoid philosopher to tell you that you can't think or, see things in your own mind. But that is one of the important aspects to him of philosophy, and it's part of art. That's like you were saying, Harrison. People who are at rest and they come up with stories, or they're coming up with mythology, or they're working things through, trying to understand the world. They're trying to understand themselves, and they're trying to understand the world, and it's an extremely important part of human life. And in fact, he goes so far to say that it's towards the perfection of human community that you have that desire within people to engage in something like that, even if they don't really know what's going on. It's just leisure, you know what I mean? But it's not producing anything, right? But it's still, in its own way, it's subversive, because people thinking on their own, it's like the authoritarians' nightmare is that people will tap into that kind of that spirit, and that spirit of wisdom that really is deep within all of us.
Well, Corey, you said quite a lot there that merits commenting on. One of them was the importance of properly used imagination. And at some point, if we have time today, I wanted to get into this novel a little bit by Philip Pullman, which gets into the importance of imagination. I think Einstein had something to say about that as well. There's a great quote by him. But you got into the necessity for using one's mind and imagination or insight, or the mind's eye, to help bridge the understanding of ourselves to objective reality, where there are some things that we might read about or contemplate which require a certain amount of extrapolation and inner visualization in order to get an approximation of how things really are when we're trying to map reality for ourselves. So on that note, getting back to Joseph Aziz's book about Gurdjieff, there was a wonderful portion of it there was so much in the book that we didn't get to discuss in the interview of a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure we'll be returning to it in various ways. But I'd like to read a little bit from this, because I think it speaks to something you just mentioned about hierarchies, and also to intelligent design, which comes to us in a book about Gurdjieff. And I know, Harrison, you had noticed that too in J.G. Bennett's work as well, that there's this kind of built-in understanding of a higher order of things that could only be attained through piecing together knowledge and using one's inner vision and powers of language to piece it together and express it in a book such as this. So from Aziz's book, the key to our present position is that reality, in the absolute sense, is a unity. Possessing the unity is not of a monolith, but of an organism. For the whole is one as, quote, as an apple is one. However, we ourselves, as part of that whole, do not possess the internal unity or individuality that we should. Lacking this unity in ourselves, our faculties cannot work as they should, and so cannot perceive objective reality. If we desire to change, then this diversity needs to be harmonized into, or at least toward, a unity, albeit a relative unity, a sort of microcosm of the larger cosmos. As A.R. Orage said in expounding Gurdjieff's system, quote, "An individual is a microcosm, but the only difference between it and the megalocosmos is that the megalocosmos is very much more actualized than we, small fry, are," end quote. Megalocosmos is clearly enough from the Greek and means, quote, "the great cosmos." Between ourselves on this planet and the whole, there are other levels or orders, such as those of the solar system and the Milky Way. Each of these can be considered as a, quote, cosmos, because it is a living being which lives, breathes, thinks, feels, is born, and dies. Each cosmos being a living entity, it follows that in our cosmos, quote, "there is only one life, and we are the highest biological development in the cosmos," end quote. This single life force manifests throughout the cosmos. In human life, it can be developed into, quote, "objective reason," which has the corollary that the purpose of human life is, quote, "to attain within objective reason." And this is, I think, the important part. He says, in this system of cosmoses, or orders, 4 insights are fundamental. 1, the universe is a creation. 2, the creation was a dynamic movement from the cosmic whole into the cosmic plurality of phenomena, so that intelligent creatures are ultimately the products of higher intelligence, not chance developments from lower forms. 3, the purpose of the universe and all that is in it is that the plurality should maintain the cosmic whole by transforming coarser substances into finer, and thereby have the chance to itself evolve into a higher form. 4, the highest purpose of humanity is consciously joining in that process of maintaining that whole through the conscious transformation of received substances, and so developing objective reason and evolving to serve higher purposes as a higher form of life. Wonderful. Mm-hmm. Just wonderful.
Perfect. Well, and that ties into what Corey was saying about understanding, because to get back to how we initially framed this discussion of leisure as not a practical thing, but I'd say if it's not practical in the sense of material and working at something to get this material result, it still has a purpose. It still has an aim. It's just a higher aim. It's not limited to that sphere of human activity, but there's still a purpose behind it. There's still benefits from it, because you could look at all the reasons why leisure is a good thing, and those would be reasons for doing it. It would be practical in that sense, in that there is a purpose that is fulfilled by making use of leisure and actually engaging in it. So, like tying a bunch of these ideas together from that quote, there is this idea behind that of, first of all, to write something like that, you need a pretty big awareness of not only philosophy and some science and basically this grand picture of the way the world is. And you have to have thought about it. Like Joseph Azizi's obviously thought about it a lot. He's encountered a lot of material, read a lot of material, but also internalized it because he's thought it for himself. And I think that's one of the uses of leisure time is to engage in that thinking process. It's a different kind of thinking. It's not a practical thinking. Oh, okay, I'm going to do this for my job because I need this, because that's what they told me to do and I need to make money. It's more of a, what is the nature of the world and how do I fit inside of it? And for Orage, and I assume for Gurdjieff too, because that's where Orage got all these ideas, and a very important thing, well, no, definitely for Gurdjieff too, was what they called pondering, to actually sit and ponder something. So this was, I'm guessing that it might be similar to what meditation actually originally meant, and meant to, for example, the Stoics. To actually meditate on something wasn't to engage in meditation like a yogi. It was to engage in a particular type of thinking about something. Like a daily meditation for a Stoic was to actively reason about the previous, or the day that you just lived. How you either met your goals or didn't, if your behavior was virtuous or not virtuous, how you measured up, essentially. So that was a meditation. So there needs to be a kind of active reasoning about the things which you have learned in order to create a picture that you can then fill in with all these details, but also then to place yourself in that picture, because as a microcosmos of the megalocosmos, to find your place in it, your purpose in it. Because you won't find your purpose in it if you don't actually actively try to find your purpose in it. You'll just end up fulfilling a mechanical purpose. Like in Gurdjieff's work, there are two opposite, or two basic modes of being. One is to fulfill your cosmic function totally mechanically, in which case you fulfill a function to the universe. It might be as fertilizer, or to engage in the world consciously, to find your place in it and to serve a higher purpose, because there is the possibility of a higher purpose. So with leisure time, you can think about and ponder the material that you've acquired from the world and all the things you've read and heard and seen, and create that picture for yourself and find that purpose for yourself. What is your purpose in this world? Why are you here? What are you doing? Mm-hmm. And you might find that, well, I'm not actually here to be a mindless automaton and working in my cubicle for some person I don't really like, helping them make more money than me. That's not really the purpose of life. That might be something that is a necessity for certain reasons, to stay alive, because you might not have very many other options. That may just be where you find yourself, but there are higher purposes over and above that. That just drab mechanical existence that you then, when you do have spare time, you spend it on something equally not enlightening or not fulfilling, to just be idle and passively just accept the things coming at you from Netflix, without any either critical mind or active engagement, because it's a pretty sad existence when you think about it, to first of all spend all of your time in a job that doesn't really give you anything except the very helpful thing of money to live and not to die. But then, in your evenings or on your weekends, you then just do nothing because it feels good. So, well, imagine looking back on your life after several decades of living, and then you look at your job. Oh, what did you accomplish in your job? It's like, well, not much to be proud of, basically. And then what did you do in your spare time? Oh, well, nothing. I just watched TV. I got in fights with my girlfriend in the weekend, and we screamed at each other. And that's it's pretty much it. There's got to be more than that, right? And if you spend a little time thinking about things, or just gathering material, everyone needs material to work with. So you should probably read or watch something to actually, with the intent of extracting something from it, and from which you can then make something. Make a picture in your mind of the way the world actually works, of objective reality and your place in it. And then your priorities might change. You might still have that crappy job. You might still have fights with your girlfriend, but you might have a purpose on top of that will actually maybe even transform the way you behave in those situations that you previously and still find yourself in. Mm-hmm. Might transform the way you approach your job, even if you keep it. You might have a more fulfilling life in your crappy job if you change your perspective on life in general, and you might actually have a better relationship with with your family and the people around you. And this gets back to the social aspect, because you talked about how Pieper says that this is a kind of there's a communal reason for leisure too, and an outcome from it. It's not what you go into it for, it's what comes out of it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that comes out of spending time together, for instance, is to actually build a better community and better relationships with the people around you. So there's this. So leisure time, if I could sum it up, would be that there should be a few purposes or aims, either that you can be consciously aware of and actually try to consciously direct your leisure time activities towards. And that would be first would be to focus on the self, your purpose, what you're doing, how you can improve, what your purpose in life is, and what you're actually doing with your life. And then there's the social aspect. Which relates to the personal aspect, of course, because the personal expands outwards towards your external world and the people you involve yourself with. So from that, then what is your social position? What are your social relationships and obligations, and what can you sacrifice for the people in your life, for your community and for the people close to you? And then overarching all of that is, and underneath it too, is this worldview that you create based on the kind of intellectual material you gain about the world. What is the nature of the world? And you can get interested in any kind of science, whatever floats your boat, whether it's biology or astronomy or something, as that kind of way in for just to have something to think about, something to place yourself in. Mm-hmm. Because I know a lot of people. I was never too obsessed with astronomy, for instance, but I know a lot of people who were, and I can see the pull towards it, because I know, probably like most kids, I liked space as a kid and astronauts and all that, and you look up at the sky, and if a lot of people just took a minute to get in the country and look in the sky, that prompts some feelings. Mm-hmm. Wow, look at all that. Mm-hmm. And what is all this? Who are we in this giant universe, and what's going on out there, and what's my place in all this? I seem totally insignificant, but so what is the purpose? Is there a purpose?
Well, the other very practical part of all of this is giving ourselves and helping ourselves to grow agency, to be active participants in the world that we live in. Because right now, with most people being locked down, for instance, the context of what we're faced with globally, or semi-globally, is all of these circumstances and limitations that are being imposed upon us from without, where we are economically and societally, we're being told we can't go out, we can't make a living, we can't do the things that we are normally used to doing. Catherine Austin Fitts recently, wonderful researcher in economics and manipulation with the Federal Reserve, among other institutions, had something very interesting to say about this in reference to people not being allowed to congregate and go to churches. She thought that there was something definitely satanic and occultish at work in keeping people separated and unable to worship. And I thought that was very interesting, coming from a lady who is so nuts and bolts and focused and chock full of hardcore data and information about government waste and corruption. For it to come from her added another level of validity to this whole thing. Whether it's true or not, the fact remains that we are at choice. We can succumb to some degree to victimhood and passivity in reference and reaction to everything that's happening around us at this point, or we can choose to some degree anyway to engage in leisure. We can engage ourselves in the questions, in, like you were saying, Harrison, our place in the grand scheme of things. It's a good question to ask for ourselves. And maybe if the question is sincere enough and is asked for long enough, there might be some answers that come to us in our environment, or in the connections that we make with others, or in a piece of information that seems to come as a revelation to ourselves, a little bit of an epiphany of, the light of truth being communicated to us, quite simply because we're asking the question. So this is as much of a constructive response to all of these forces around us, I think, as we can come up with, in addition to the practical, preparing for the future and all that would entail.
Yes, and on that note, everybody, we're going to wrap up the show for today. So we hope that you enjoy some of your free time, and that you find your questions and you find some peace, and know that the spirit that connects all of us. We're all united in this, no matter how crazy things get, and we all wish you the best, and we hope that you tune in next time to listen to us jabber jaw some more. Bye, everybody.